The rain wasn't heavy, but it was steady. The kind that soaks your shoes before you even notice and leaves your jacket damp no matter how tightly you zip it. 16-year-old Deshaun Carter stood under the bus stop awning, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his backpack slung low on one shoulder. He'd just finished his shift at the community center, where he spent 2 hours after school helping younger kids with their math homework. It wasn't glamorous work, and it didn't pay much, but it mattered. Especially to him. Deshaun had always been good with numbers. Not in a flashy way, no trophies or math Olympiads, but in the quiet, steady way that made fractions click for a frustrated 10-year-old or turned a confused frown into a relieved grin. He liked seeing that moment when something finally made sense. It reminded him of his own grandmother, who used to sit with him at their kitchen table sliding pencils across worn notebook paper saying, "You got this, baby. Just take your time." Now, with his grandmother gone and his mom working double shifts at the hospital, Deshaun had taken on more responsibility than most kids his age. Not because he wanted to be a hero, but because someone had to. He didn't complain. He just showed up every day on time with his hood pulled up against the drizzle and his mind already running through the evening's to-do list. Finish his own homework, check in on his little cousin who lived down the hall, maybe squeeze in a quick walk with their neighbor's dog if the rain let up. The bus rumbled to a stop with a hiss of brakes and a cloud of steam from the wet pavement. Deshaun stepped on, swiped his student pass, and moved toward the back. The bus was about half full, mostly tired-looking adults heading home from work, a couple of teenagers with earbuds in, and one woman cradling a grocery bag like it held something fragile. He found a seat near the rear window, slid in, and leaned his head against the cool glass. Outside, streetlights flickered on as dusk settled over the city. He closed his eyes for just a second. He didn't sleep, just let his mind drift. He thought about the kid he'd helped today, a quiet boy named Eli who'd finally solved a long division problem without help. The way Eli's eyes lit up, that was worth more than any paycheck. Deshaun smiled faintly, then opened his eyes as the bus slowed for the next stop. The doors opened and in stepped an elderly woman. She wore a faded lavender coat, slightly too big for her frame, and gripped a wooden cane with both hands as she carefully climbed the steps. Her silver hair was tucked under a knit cap, damp at the edges from the rain. She paused just inside the bus, scanning the seats with tired but sharp eyes. Most passengers kept their gazes down, on phones, out windows, at nothing in particular. No one moved. Deshaun didn't think. He just stood. "Ma'am, you can have my seat," he said, voice soft but clear. The woman turned, surprised. For a moment, she just looked at him, really looked, as if trying to place him in a memory. Then her face softened. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice warm like worn velvet. "You sure?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied, stepping into the aisle to give her space. She shuffled over slowly, cane tapping lightly against the floor. As she settled into the seat, she patted his arm. "Bless your heart," she murmured. Not many young folks do that these days. Deshaun shrugged, a little embarrassed. "My grandma always said it's just the right thing to do." The woman's eyes glistened for a second, but she nodded and gave him a small smile. "She sounds like a wise woman." He moved to the front of the bus, standing near the fare box where a handrail hung from the ceiling. The bus rolled forward again, swaying gently as it navigated the wet streets. Raindrops streaked the windows, blurring the passing storefronts into smears of color and light. Deshaun watched them pass, thinking about nothing in particular, just the rhythm of the ride, the hum of the engine, the distant sound of a siren somewhere in the city. He didn't notice when the elderly woman got off. One moment she was there, the next the bus was a little quieter, a little emptier. He assumed she'd stepped off at Maple Street, like most of the older folks in the neighborhood. He didn't think about her again until later that night. Back at home, Deshaun kicked off his damp sneakers by the door and tossed his backpack onto the couch. His mom wasn't home yet. She wouldn't be for another hour. But the apartment smelled faintly of the soup she'd left simmering on the stove before her shift. He grabbed a bowl, poured himself some, and sat at the small kitchen table, scrolling through his phone while he ate. Homework could wait another 20 minutes. After dinner, he dug into his backpack for his math textbook. As he pulled it out, something fluttered to the floor, a small folded piece of paper, crisp and white like it had just come from a fresh notepad. Frowning, he picked it up. He didn't remember putting anything in his pocket today. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was neat, looping but precise, the kind you only see in people who grew up writing letters by hand. It read, "You reminded me of my grandson. Thank you for seeing me when others looked away. If you're ever in need, call this number." Beneath it was a phone number and a name, Ilara Whitmore. Deshaun stared at the note. His heart did a strange little skip. He turned it over, half expecting more, but the back was blank. He read it again, slower this time. "You reminded me of my grandson." The words felt heavy, like they carried more than just gratitude. And when others looked away, and that part stuck with him. He hadn't done anything special. He'd just offered a seat. Was that really so rare? He tucked the note into the front pocket of his backpack, unsure what to do with it. Part of him wanted to call right away, just to say thanks or ask if she was okay. But another part, the cautious part, the part that had learned early not to expect too much, hesitated. What if it was a mistake? What if she'd meant to give it to someone else? Or worse, what if it was some kind of scam? He shook his head and pushed the thought aside. Tomorrow was another long day. School, tutoring, maybe a trip to the laundromat. He'd deal with it later, but the note stayed with him. Not in a loud way, but like a quiet hum in the back of his mind. As he lay in bed that night, listening to the rain tap against his window, he thought about Ilara, her tired eyes, her gentle voice, the way she'd looked at him like he was someone worth remembering. He wondered who her grandson was, if he was still around, if he knew how much his grandmother missed him. And for the first time in a while, Deshaun felt something he hadn't expected. Seen. Not as a kid from the wrong side of town, not as just another face on the bus, but as someone who mattered, even if just for a moment. He fell asleep with the note folded under his pillow, not knowing that this small slip of paper would soon open a door he never imagined walking through, not knowing that kindness, even the quietest kind, has a way of coming back around, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle. Somewhere across the city, an old woman sat by her window sipping tea and hoping she'd done the right thing by leaving that note. She didn't know Deshaun's name, but she knew his heart. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. Life didn't stop for notes left in jacket pockets. Deshaun folded Ilara's message once, twice, then slipped it into the inside pocket of his backpack, the one he only used for things he didn't want to lose. He told himself he'd think about it later. But later kept getting pushed further away, buried under school projects, tutoring sessions, and the constant hum of trying to keep everything together at home. His mom worked nights now, which meant mornings were quiet. Dinners were reheated leftovers, and weekends blurred into one long stretch of chores and catching up on sleep. Still, the note lingered in his thoughts like a song he couldn't quite place, familiar but just out of reach. A week passed. Then another. One afternoon, while digging through his backpack for a permission slip he'd forgotten to sign, his fingers brushed against the folded paper again. He pulled it out, smoothed it on his knee, and read it once more. The words hadn't changed, but something in him had. Maybe it was the way his math teacher had looked at him that morning, proud, almost surprised when he solved a problem no one else could. Or maybe it was the way his little cousin had hugged him extra tight the night before, whispering, "You're the best big brother ever," after Deshaun helped him fix a broken toy car with duct tape and patience. Whatever it was, the note no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like an invitation. But calling a stranger, especially an elderly woman who'd handed him a note on a bus, still made his stomach twist. What if she didn't remember him? What if she thought he was weird for calling over something so small? He almost put the note back. Then his phone buzzed. It was a text from his mom. "They're cutting hours. Might not get full shifts next week." Deshaun's chest tightened. He knew what that meant. Rent was due in 10 days. The electric bill was already late. They'd been stretching every dollar so thin it was practically see-through. He typed back, "It's okay, Mama, we'll figure it out," even though he had no idea how. That night, sitting on the edge of his bed with the city lights flickering through his window, he stared at the number on the note. His fingers hovered over the dial pad. He took a breath and called. The phone rang once, twice. Just as he was about to hang up, a voice answered, soft but clear like wind chimes on a calm day. "Hello? Hi," Deshaun said, suddenly nervous. "My name's Deshaun. I sat next to you on the bus a couple weeks ago. You gave me a note," a pause. Then warmth bloomed in her voice. Deshaun, oh, I'm so glad you called, he blinked. She remembered him. Just like that. They talked for nearly 20 minutes. She didn't ask why he was calling, just listened as he stumbled through an explanation about school, his mom's job, how things had gotten tight. He didn't pour his whole life out, but he didn't sugarcoat it either. And she didn't offer empty promises or pity. She just said, "Come see me tomorrow. I'd like to meet you properly." She gave him an address in the older part of town. Tree-lined streets, brick houses with porches, the kind of neighborhood where people still left cookies for new neighbors. He'd never been there before. The next afternoon after school, he took 2 buses and walked 3 blocks. The house was modest but well kept, with a garden out front full of late-blooming marigolds and a rocking chair on the porch. Before he could knock, the door opened. Ilara stood there in a soft blue sweater, her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun. She smiled like she'd been waiting for him all day. "There you are," she said, as if he were expected. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and old books. Sunlight poured through lace curtains, painting patterns on hardwood floors. Photos lined the walls, black and white shots of marches, a young man in a graduation cap, a couple holding hands on a beach. "Tea?" she asked, already moving toward the kitchen. "Sure, ma'am." She poured 2 cups and sat across from him at a small wooden table. For a while, they just talked. About the weather, about the community center, about how hard it was to find good bus drivers these days. Then quietly, she asked, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" Deshaun hesitated. Most adults asked that like it was a formality, but Ilara looked at him like the answer mattered. "I want to be an engineer," he said. "Build things that help people, like clean water systems or better housing." Her eyes lit up. "My husband used to say engineering was poetry with purpose." "Your husband?" She nodded toward a photo on the shelf, a tall man in a suit standing beside Dr. King at a rally in '63. He was a lawyer, fought for fair housing, voting rights, believed justice wasn't just in courtrooms but in how cities were built, how neighborhoods were planned. She paused. "He'd have liked you." Deshaun didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever said something like that to him before. Before he left, Ilara handed him a plain white envelope. "Don't open it until you're home," she said, pressing it into his hands. He walked back to the bus stop in a daze. The envelope felt heavier than it should. At home, he sat on his bed and tore it open. Inside was a check, not a small one. It was enough to cover their rent. And then some tucked behind it was a letter, typed but signed in her looping handwriting. It recommended him for a summer engineering immersion program at a university 2 hours away. A program he'd seen online months ago but never applied to because the fee was more than his mom made in a week. "You belong there," the letter read. "Don't let anyone, including yourself, tell you otherwise." Deshaun read it 3 times. Then he called his mom. When she got home that night, he showed her everything. She cried, not sad tears, but the kind that come when hope sneaks in through a crack you didn't know was there. Over the next few days, Deshaun filled out the application. Ilara helped him draft his personal statement over the phone, asking questions that made him think deeper than he ever had before. "Why engineering?" she'd ask. "Not just what you want to build, but who you want to lift up while you're building it." He wrote about the community center, about kids who didn't have safe places to study, about how clean water shouldn't be a luxury, about his grandmother who taught him that respect starts with seeing people. The day he hit submit, he felt lighter. A week later, he got the acceptance email. Full scholarship. Housing included. He called Ilara right away. She laughed, a sound like bells. "Of course they said yes," she said. "You're exactly who they're looking for." But the real surprise came a few days after that. Deshaun was walking home from the grocery store, bags in hand, when he passed a group of kids from his school huddled under the awning of the bus stop. One of them, a 7th grader named Tariq, waved him over. "Yo, Deshaun! You're the guy who gave up your seat, right?" He frowned. "What?" "Someone posted about it on the neighborhood group chat," Tariq said, pulling out his phone. "Said an old lady got off the bus crying because a black kid treated her like a human being." Deshaun's face burned. He hadn't done it for attention. He hadn't done it for anything. But then Tariq grinned. "My grandma said we should all do that. So we started giving up seats this week. Even Mr. Jenkins, he's like 80, got someone to carry his groceries yesterday." Deshaun stood there stunned. His small act, just standing up, Just saying ma'am had sparked something. Not a movement, not a headline, but a quiet shift in how people looked at each other on that bus route. That night, he sat at his desk and wrote Ilara a letter. Not an email. Real paper, real ink. He told her about Tariq, about the kids giving up seats, about how maybe kindness was contagious in the best way. He didn't know it yet. But this was just the beginning. Because Ilara wasn't just a kind stranger, she was a keeper of doors, and she'd just opened one for him, one that led to classrooms, mentors, blueprints, and a future he'd only dreamed of. But more than that, she'd reminded him that his presence mattered, that his choices rippled outward, touching lives he'd never even meet. As he sealed the envelope, he realized something. He didn't need to be loud to make a difference. Sometimes, all it took was a seat and the courage to stand up. The morning Deshawn left for the summer engineering program, the sky was pale blue and quiet, like the whole city was holding its breath. His mom stood on the porch in her slippers, arms crossed tight over her chest, trying not to cry. She'd stayed up half the night ironing his one nice shirt and packing peanut butter sandwiches, just in case the food's weird. Deshawn hugged her hard, promising to call every night, even if it was just for 2 minutes. He carried one duffel bag, a notebook filled with questions he was too nervous to ask out loud, and Ilara's letter tucked inside his wallet like a good luck charm. The university campus was nothing like he'd imagined. Not because it was grand, though the buildings were old and tall with ivy climbing the brick, but because it felt alive in a way he hadn't expected. Students moved with purpose, laughing in clusters, arguing over equations on whiteboards, building strange contraptions in open-air labs. For a moment he froze near the entrance, suddenly sure he didn't belong. Then his phone buzzed, a text from Ilara. "Walk like you've got somewhere to be, because you do." He took a breath, adjusted his bag, and stepped forward. The program was intense. 6 weeks of physics, coding, design challenges, and late-night study sessions in dorm lounges that smelled like coffee and burnt popcorn. Deshawn struggled at first. Some kids had been coding since middle school. Others came from private schools with robotics labs. He'd never even held a 3D printer before, but he didn't quit. Instead, he asked questions. Lots of them. He stayed after class to practice CAD software. He traded math help for coding tips with a quiet girl from Oregon who wore mismatched socks and could build a drone from spare parts. Slowly, he caught up. Then he started leading. During the 3rd week, the group was assigned a real-world challenge: design a low-cost water filtration system for rural communities. Deshawn's team hit a wall. They couldn't get the flow rate right without expensive materials. Frustrated, they sat in silence around a table littered with sketches and empty soda cans. Then Deshawn remembered something his grandmother used to do. She'd strain, cooking oil through layers of cloth and charcoal to reuse it. "Waste not," she'd say. "What if we use activated charcoal and layered fabric?" He suggested. "Like old-school filters, but optimized?" His teammates stared. Then one grinned. "Dude, that might actually work." They tested it the next day. It worked better than expected. Their prototype wasn't flashy, but it was practical, affordable, and built with materials you could find almost anywhere. When they presented it to the judges, a panel of engineers and professors, Deshawn spoke last. He didn't talk about flow rates or pressure differentials. He talked about his cousin's school in a nearby town where the water sometimes came out brown. He talked about dignity, about how clean water shouldn't be a privilege. Afterward, a woman in a crisp blazer pulled him aside. "You ever thought about applying here for college?" She asked. He hadn't. Not really. It felt too far away, too expensive, too impossible. But now he wasn't so sure. Halfway through the program, Ilara surprised him with a visit. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon, leaning on her cane but wearing a bright yellow scarf and a smile that lit up the entire courtyard. Deshawn ran to meet her, suddenly feeling like a little kid again. "You came?" he said, stunned. "I wanted to see where you're building your future," she replied. He showed her around, his dorm room, tiny with a view of a parking lot, the lab where they'd built the filter, the cafeteria where he'd learned to like tofu, sort of. She listened to every detail, asked thoughtful questions, and even sat in on a guest lecture about sustainable infrastructure. Afterward, over lemonade at a campus cafe, she said quietly, "You're not just learning how to build things, Deshawn. You're learning how to lead." He shook his head. I'm just trying not to mess up. That's what real leaders do, she said. They care enough to try. On her last day, she handed him another envelope. This one wasn't a check. It was a brochure for a national youth leadership summit focused on STEM and community impact. Apply, she said. I'll write your recommendation. He did. And he got in. But the biggest surprise came after the program ended. Back home, Deshaun couldn't stop thinking about the kids at his school, the ones who thought college wasn't for them, who'd never touched a circuit board or written a line of code. He remembered how lost he'd felt walking onto campus, how close he'd come to turning around. What if they never had to feel that way? One evening, while helping his cousin with homework, an idea sparked. What if we started something right here? He asked. His cousin looked up from his math worksheet. Like what? Like a club where we teach kids how to build stuff. Simple things at first, solar ovens, basic circuits, maybe even a robot made from old toys. His cousin's eyes widened. You'd do that? Yeah, Deshaun said. But I'd call it something else. Not a club. Something warmer. That night he stayed up late drafting a plan. He called it Seats of Respect. Not just because of the bus, but because every project would start with a question. How can this help someone feel seen? He pitched it to his school's principal the next week. To his surprise, she loved it. We've got an empty classroom after 3 p.m., she said, and a small budget for supplies. He texted Alara the news. Her reply came fast. I always knew you'd pay it forward. The first meeting was small, just 5 kids, including Tariq and his cousin. They built paper circuits that lit up with tiny LEDs, spelling out words like hope and future. No one cared that the wires were crooked or the batteries kept falling out. They were creating something. Together. Word spread. By the 3rd week, 12 kids showed up. By the 5th, they'd run out of chairs. Deshaun didn't do it alone. He recruited a retired electrician from his building to help with wiring. A local artist taught them how to design enclosures from recycled plastic. Even his mom pitched in, baking cookies for invention nights. One afternoon, as he helped a shy 6th grader troubleshoot a motor, he looked around the room, kids laughing, arguing over designs, high-fiving when something worked, and felt a quiet swell of pride. This was more than a club. It was a space where they all belonged. Then came the local news feature. A reporter had heard about Seats of Respect from a teacher and wanted to do a short piece. Deshaun was nervous. What if it felt like bragging? But Alara encouraged him. Let them see what's possible, she said. The segment aired on a Tuesday evening. It showed kids testing a mini wind turbine on the school roof, Deshaun explaining how small actions lead to big change, and a clip of him saying, kindness isn't weak. It's the strongest foundation you can build on. After it aired, messages poured in from parents, teachers, even strangers. One woman wrote, my son saw you on TV and said, maybe I can be an engineer too. Thank you. Deshaun read that message 3 times. He'd never thought his story could matter to someone else, but it did. And that changed everything, because now, it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every kid who needed to hear, you belong here. You have something to offer. Start where you are. As summer turned to fall, Seats of Respect became a fixture at the school. They entered a citywide science fair and won 2nd place for a rainwater collector made from repurposed bottles. Deshaun gave a short talk at the community center about how small acts of respect, like giving up a seat, can spark something bigger. Alara sat in the front row, beaming. Afterward, she pulled him aside. You're ready for what's next, she said. He didn't know what she meant, but he would soon. Because Alara had been quietly working behind the scenes, not just supporting him, but building a path for others like him. And before the year was out, she'd reveal a plan that would change his life all over again. For now, though he was happy right where he was, standing in a classroom full of kids who believed in themselves, a little more because someone had believed in them first. And that was enough. More than enough. The fall air carried a crispness that made everything feel possible. Leaves turned gold and rust, crunching underfoot as Deshaun walked to school each morning, his mind buzzing with plans for Seats of Respect. The club had grown faster than he'd imagined, now meeting twice a week, with a waiting list and a corner of the school library permanently reserved for their projects. Kids who used to skip homework were staying late to solder circuits. Shy students were presenting their designs with voices that didn't shake. It felt like magic, but Deshawn knew it wasn't magic. It was momentum, and momentum needed fuel. That fuel came one rainy Thursday in November. He'd just finished helping a group test a solar-powered phone charger made from an old cookie tin when his phone buzzed. It was Ilara. Not a text this time, a call. "Can you come by after school?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. "Of course," he said. "Everything okay?" "A little tired, that's all. But I have something to show you." He arrived at her house just as the streetlights flickered on. She opened the door in a thick cardigan, her face pale but her eyes bright. Come in," she said, waving him inside like he was family. The living room looked different. Boxes were stacked along the walls, labeled in neat handwriting. Photos, letters, foundation files. "Foundation?" Deshawn asked, glancing at one. Ilara nodded, settling into her favorite armchair with a sigh. "I've been meaning to tell you about this. My husband and I, we never had children of our own, but we always believed in investing in young people who wanted to build a better world. So years ago, we set up a small foundation, just enough to help a few students each year with scholarships, mentorship, startup costs for community projects." She paused, looking at him like she was measuring something only she could see. "I've been funding your program quietly," she admitted. "The materials, the science fair entry fee, even the bus passes for kids who couldn't afford to stay late." Deshawn's breath caught. You did that?" "I believe in you," she said simply. "And I believe in what you're building." Then she reached for a folder on the coffee table and handed it to him. Inside were documents, legal, financial, official-looking. At the top of the first page, the Whitmore Youth Innovation Fund. "I'm getting older, Deshawn," she said gently. "And I won't be around forever. But this work, it doesn't have to stop with me." His heart pounded. "What are you saying?" "I want you to help shape its future," she said. "Not run it alone, there's a board, an accountant, all that. But I want your voice at the table, your ideas, your heart." He stared at the papers, overwhelmed. This wasn't just support. This was trust. Real, deep, life-altering trust. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," he admitted. Ilara smiled. "You already are." Over the next few weeks, they met often. Sometimes at her house, sometimes over tea at a quiet cafe downtown. She introduced him to the foundation's board members, a retired engineer, a high school principal, a woman who ran a nonprofit for girls in DEM. They listened to his vision, not just for seats of year, respect, but for a citywide network of youth-led innovation hubs in underserved neighborhoods. "You're thinking bigger than I ever did," Ilara told him one afternoon, pride warming her voice. But just as things were gaining speed, life threw a curveball. Ilara fell ill. Not suddenly, just slowly, the way time catches up with all of us. She grew weaker, spent more days in bed, and eventually moved into a small assisted living home near the park she loved. Deshawn visited every Sunday, bringing her updates. How many kids joined the club, how one student had built a sensor to alert elderly neighbors if their stove was left on, how the local hardware store had started donating scrap materials. She listened with her eyes closed sometimes, but she always had a question. Did they feel proud? She'd ask. Did they see themselves as creators? Yes, he'd say. Every time. One Sunday in late winter, she held his hand longer than usual. "Promise me something," she said. "Anything. Don't wait for permission to lead. The world needs builders like you, now not later," he promised. A month later, Ilara passed away peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was small, just close friends, former students, and a few people from the civil rights days who still called her sister. Deshawn stood near the back, holding the original bus note in his pocket like an anchor. When it was over, the foundation's lawyer handed him a sealed envelope. "She left this for you," he said. Inside was a letter. "Deshawn, if you're reading this, I'm gone. But don't you dare stop. The foundation is yours to guide now, along with the board. Use it wisely. Use it boldly. And never forget, the smallest act of respect can change a life. You changed mine. With love, Ilara." Beneath it was a key to a safety deposit box. Inside the box, a final gift, a fully funded grant to launch his first youth innovation lab, not just a classroom. A real space with workbenches, 3D printers, a small machine shop, even a garden out back for testing sustainable designs. All in his own neighborhood. The news spread fast. The school threw a celebration. The mayor sent a letter of support. Former Seats of Respect kids showed up with blueprints they'd drawn for the new space. Deshaun stood in the middle of it all, humbled and heartful, knowing this wasn't just his dream anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever believed in him. He named the lab the Whitmore Workshop. Construction began that spring. Deshaun worked alongside volunteers, painting walls, assembling shelves, installing solar panels on the roof. Kids from the club came after school to help, turning the build itself into a project. One group designed a smart lighting system that adjusted based on natural light. Another built a rainwater collection system for the garden. It wasn't perfect. Paint got on the floors. Wires got tangled, but it was theirs. The night before the official opening, Deshaun stayed late, walking through the empty space. He ran his hand over a workbench still smelling of sawdust, looked at the whiteboard covered in scribbled ideas, and thought of Ilara. He wished she could see it. Then he remembered. She didn't need to. She'd known it would happen. That's why she'd bet on him. The opening day arrived warm and bright. The street in front of the lab was lined with families, teachers, local business owners, and kids wearing handmade inventor badges. A local jazz band played softly in the corner. There were no speeches at first, just open doors and open minds. Deshaun wandered through the crowd, watching as children tested robots, parents tried out ergonomic stools designed by teens, and elders sat in the garden sipping lemonade from cups printed on the lab's 3D printer. Then someone tapped his shoulder. It was Tariq, now in high school, holding a small device. "Check this out," he said, eyes gleaming. "It's a doorbell for people who can't hear. Flashes a light when someone's at the door." Deshaun grinned. "You built that?" "With help from your cousin," Tariq said. "We're calling it the Ilara." Tears pricked Deshaun's eyes. He pulled Tariq into a hug. She'd love that. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Deshaun stood on the front steps and finally spoke. Not a formal speech, just words from the heart. "This place isn't about fancy tools or big inventions," he said, voice steady. "It's about saying to every kid who walks through that door, you matter. Your ideas matter. And you don't have to wait to make a difference." He looked out at the faces, hopeful, curious, proud. "That's what Ilara taught me. And now it's our turn to pass it on." After the crowd thinned, Deshaun found a quiet moment in the workshop. He pinned the original bus note to the wall above his desk, next to a photo of Ilara at a march in 1965. Her sign reading, "Justice is built by hand." Outside, laughter floated through the open windows. Somewhere a drill whirred to life. A group of kids debated the best way to power a tiny fan using only recycled materials. Deshaun smiled. This was more than a lab. It was a promise, kept, and now passed forward. And he knew deep in his bones that Ilara was smiling too. 5 years had passed since that rainy bus ride, but Deshaun still remembered the exact sound of the brakes hissing, the smell of wet wool from Ilara's coat, the quiet weight of her hand on his arm when he offered his seat. Now standing in front of a crowd on a bright June morning, he adjusted his collar and took a slow breath. Today wasn't about him. It was about everything that had grown from that one small moment. The street in front of the Whitmore Workshop was closed off for the occasion. Banners fluttered in the breeze, kids darted between tables showing off their latest inventions, and the scent of grilled corn and fresh lemonade drifted from the food tents. This wasn't just an opening, it was a homecoming. The workshop had outgrown its original space, and with support from the city and private donors, many of them former students, they'd built something bigger. A full youth innovation lab with classrooms, a prototyping studio, and even a tiny greenhouse for testing sustainable urban farming ideas. Deshaun wasn't the only one who'd grown. The kids who once built paper circuits now mentored younger students. Tariq was studying electrical engineering on a full scholarship. His little cousin had started a podcast about young inventors in their neighborhood. And every Saturday, a group of elders, some of them regulars from the bus route, came by to share stories and help test accessibility designs. The lab had become more than a place to build things. It had become a community. As he stepped up to the microphone, Deshaun scanned the crowd. His mom sat in the front row, beaming. Behind her, a dozen teens from the lab stood with arms crossed, trying to look cool but clearly proud. And near the back, under the shade of an oak tree, sat a woman in a wheelchair, Mrs. Langley, one of Alara's oldest friends, who'd helped guide the foundation after Alara passed. He didn't read from notes. He just spoke from the heart. Most people think big change starts with big actions, he began, voice calm but strong. But I learned something different. I learned that it starts with seeing someone. Really seeing them. Not as a stranger, not as a problem, not as someone to ignore, but as a person who matters. He paused, letting the words settle. 5 years ago, I gave up a seat on a bus. That's all. But that small act reminded an amazing woman that kindness still existed, and she in turn reminded me that I had something to offer the world, even when I didn't believe it myself. A few people nodded. Some wiped their eyes. Alara didn't just give me money or opportunities, he continued. She gave me trust. And that trust became a seed. This lab, it's that seed grown into something none of us could have imagined alone. He gestured to the building behind him. Solar panels on the roof. Murals painted by local artists. Windows wide open to let in the sound of kids laughing. Every project here starts with a question. How can this help someone feel seen? Because that's what changed my life. Being seen. After his talk, the crowd broke into small groups. Kids demonstrated a water-purifying backpack they'd designed for homeless shelters. A team of middle schoolers showed off a voice-activated light switch for people with limited mobility. In the garden, 2 girls explained how their compost system could cut food waste in school cafeterias by 40%. Deshaun moved through it all. Not as a boss, but as a guide, answering questions, offering encouragement, sometimes just listening. He stopped to watch a shy boy carefully calibrate a robotic arm he'd built from old toy parts. When it finally gripped a small ball and lifted it, the boy looked up, eyes wide with triumph. You did that, Deshaun said softly. All you. The boy grinned. Yeah, I did. Later that afternoon, Deshaun walked to the bus stop at the end of the block, the same one where it all began. He didn't need to catch a ride. He just liked to stand there sometimes, remembering. An elderly man with a cane shuffled toward the bench. Without thinking, Deshaun stepped forward. You can sit here, sir, he said, gesturing to the dry spot under the awning. The man looked up, surprised, then smiled. Thank you, son. Deshaun nodded and stayed standing. A few minutes later, a young woman with a stroller approached. He moved aside to give her space. Then a teenager with crutches. He made room again. He wasn't doing it for thanks. He was doing it because it felt right, because Alara had shown him that respect isn't a grand gesture. It's a daily choice. And that choice ripples. Back at the lab, as the sun began to dip, Deshaun unlocked his office. It was small but full of life. Blueprints pinned to the walls, a shelf of handmade thank you cards, a model of the original water filter from his summer program. And above his desk, framed in simple wood, hung the note. You reminded me of my grandson. Thank you for seeing me when others looked away. He'd read it 1,000 times, but it still gave him chills. He sat down and opened his laptop. An email notification blinked, a message from a high school in another state. They'd heard about the Whitmore workshop and wanted to start something similar. Could he share advice? Maybe even visit? He typed back right away. Absolutely. And you don't need a big building to start. Just a table, some curiosity, and the belief that every kid has something to give. As he hit send, his phone buzzed. It was his mom. Proud of you, the text read. Your grandma would be too, he smiled. He knew she would. That night, after everyone had gone home and the lights in the lab were dimmed, Deshaun stayed late. He walked through the quiet rooms, turning off machines, straightening chairs, checking that the 3D printers were idle. In the main studio, a half-finished project sat on a workbench, a small device with blinking LEDs and coiled wires. A sticky note was taped to it. For Deshaun, to remind you to keep going. Aaliyah, age 12. He picked it up gently. It was a simple nightlight, shaped like a star, programmed to glow softly when it got dark. He carried it back to his office and plugged it in. The soft light filled the room warm and steady. Outside, the city hummed. Cars passed. Distant music floated from an open window. Somewhere, a bus rolled down the street, its headlights cutting through the night. Deshaun sat in the quiet glow, thinking not about how far he'd come, but about who he'd become and who he was helping others become. He wasn't just an engineer now. He was a bridge, a listener, a believer, and that was enough, more than enough, because the real legacy wasn't in the building or tea.